The 7 most racist guests Johnny Carson ever had. For 30 years, Johnny Carson reigned as television's undisputed king of late night, welcoming America's biggest stars into living rooms across the nation with his trademark charm, quick wit, and seemingly effortless interview style. From his NBC desk, Carson created a cultural touchstone that defined American entertainment for a generation, a show where celebrities let their guards down and revealed more authentic versions of themselves than anywhere else on television. But that unguarded authenticity sometimes revealed uncomfortable truths about America's most beloved stars, especially as the country's attitudes toward race evolved dramatically during Carson's 3-decade tenure. The Tonight Show's extended format and relaxed atmosphere occasionally exposed prejudices that more tightly controlled television appearances kept hidden, creating a historical record of casual racism that many fans have conveniently forgotten. Johnny operated at the intersection of old and new Hollywood, explained a former NBC executive who worked closely with The Tonight Show during the 1970s and 80s. He welcomed the established stars who came up in an era when racist humor and attitudes were simply part of the entertainment landscape. But he was also navigating a changing America where those same attitudes were increasingly recognized as harmful and unacceptable. This tension created complex dynamics on air, as Carson attempted to balance respect for industry legends with emerging awareness of racial sensitivity. His own evolving perspectives on race, generally progressive for his time, but still limited by the standards of later decades, influenced how he handled guests, whose views ranged from subtly prejudiced to overtly racist. Carson was caught between worlds, noted television historian Margaret Collins. He couldn't simply cancel every star with problematic racial attitudes. That would have eliminated half of Hollywood's biggest names in the 60s and 70s. But the archival footage shows him becoming increasingly uncomfortable with certain guests over time, creating subtle but noticeable shifts in how he handled their appearances. Today we examine 7 of Johnny Carson's most racially problematic guests, entertainment legends whose Tonight Show appearances revealed prejudices that contradict their polished public images, illuminating how America's understanding of racism evolved during television's formative decades, and how even the nation's most beloved stars weren't immune to the prejudices of their eras.
How are you? What a kick.
Oh, I'm pretty good.
Somebody told me you were in the building, and I didn't know you were going to swing in here. It was very nice.
America's cowboy, John Wayne. Few figures embodied American mythology more completely than John Wayne, the rugged individualist whose film persona celebrated frontier justice, straightforward masculinity, and unwavering patriotism. As one of Hollywood's most bankable stars for decades, Wayne represented a particular vision of American identity that resonated deeply with millions of viewers. His appearances on The Tonight Show typically celebrated this carefully crafted image, with Carson treating him with the deference due to a living legend. But behind Wayne's iconic screen presence lay political and racial views that contradicted the inclusive vision of America that was gradually gaining ground during Carson's tenure. These views burst into public awareness through a notorious 1971 Playboy interview where Wayne expressed sentiments that went far beyond conservative politics into explicitly racist territory. Playboy interview, 1971. I believe in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility, noted entertainment journalist Thomas Henderson, quoting Wayne's most infamous statement from the interview. This wasn't an ambiguous comment or something that could be explained away as a misunderstanding. It was an explicit endorsement of white supremacy from one of America's most beloved cultural icons. The interview contained numerous other troubling statements, including Wayne's defense of European colonizers taking land from Native Americans. There were great numbers of people who needed new land, and the Indians were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves, and dismissal of systemic racism in Hollywood. These comments revealed views that directly contradicted Wayne's public image as the embodiment of American fairness and justice. Carson interviewed him multiple times, Henderson continued. Wayne was a frequent guest both before and after the Playboy interview became public. The interesting question isn't just what Wayne believed, but how Carson navigated interviewing someone whose racist views had become a matter of public record. Archival footage of Wayne's Tonight Show appearances reveals subtle but notable shifts in Carson's approach after the Playboy interview. While always maintaining professional courtesy, Carson's body language and engagement level changed in ways that suggested increased distance from his guest. The easy camaraderie of earlier interviews gave way to a more formal, slightly cooler dynamic, noticeable to careful observers, but never crossing into outright confrontation. While Wayne never said anything overtly racist on air, Carson knew about the quote, and their last few interviews were visibly colder, noted television historian Margaret Collins. Carson never directly challenged Wayne about his views. That wasn't his style, particularly with older stars he respected, but you can see a palpable change in their interaction quality. The warmth diminished significantly. Carson's handling of Wayne after the interview reflected the complex balancing act he maintained throughout his tenure, acknowledging changing social standards while avoiding direct confrontation with established stars. Rather than banning Wayne or publicly criticizing him, Carson maintained a professional relationship while subtly creating emotional distance that attentive viewers could recognize. America's cowboy wasn't just tough, he was openly white nationalist. This observation captures the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Wayne's public persona, the gap between the just, honorable characters he portrayed on screen and the explicitly racist views he expressed in his own voice. Carson's evolving approach to Wayne reflects his gradual recognition of this contradiction and his increasingly uncomfortable position as the host who welcomed Wayne into America's living rooms. Wayne's appearances on The Tonight Show represent a particular challenge in assessing historical racism, how to reconcile immense cultural influence and genuine artistic contribution with explicitly stated racist beliefs that directly harmed the communities they targeted. Carson never fully resolved this tension, maintaining professional respect for Wayne's stature while creating subtle distance that acknowledged the problematic nature of his views without directly confronting them on air.
Kind of material you did? Were you told beforehand?
No, they didn't have any problem with the material, no.
Yeah.
The comedy legend, Bob Hope. Bob Hope represented the establishment of American comedy when he appeared on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, a living connection to vaudeville, early radio, and the USO shows that had made him a beloved figure among multiple generations of Americans. His patriotic credentials, tireless performances for American troops, and grandfatherly public persona had earned him a special place in American entertainment, one that largely insulated him from criticism of the racist content that had characterized much of his early career. Long history of doing racist jokes, blackface comedy, and Chinaman accents during early years, noted entertainment historian Robert Thompson. Hope came up in an era when these forms of humor were standard fare in American entertainment, and like many comics of his generation, he built parts of his early career on racist caricatures and stereotypes that would be completely unacceptable by modern standards. Unlike some performers who acknowledged the problematic nature of their early material as social attitudes evolved, Hope maintained a notably resistant stance toward changing standards of racial sensitivity in comedy. When questioned about his use of racist stereotypes in his early career, he typically dismissed concerns rather than acknowledging their harmful impact, refused to apologize for past routines, defended them as of the time, Thompson continued. This response reflected a common attitude among entertainers of Hope's generation, the belief that evolving standards represented unnecessary political correctness, rather than legitimate concerns about the harmful effects of racial stereotyping. Perhaps most troubling was Hope's continued use of racially insensitive material well into eras when such content had become widely recognized as problematic. While he moderated the most explicitly racist aspects of his early performances, his comedy continued to rely on ethnic and racial stereotypes that younger comedians had largely abandoned as harmful. Often used racial stereotypes during televised roasts and interviews, noted a former NBC executive who worked with both Carson and Hope. Even into the 1970s and 80s, Hope would occasionally drop jokes targeting various ethnic groups into his Tonight Show appearances. Carson would typically respond with a tight smile or quick pivot, rather than laughing heartily or building on the joke, a subtle signal of discomfort that attentive viewers might notice. Carson's handling of Hope presented particular challenges given the older comedian's iconic status, and Carson's own admiration for Hope's contributions to American comedy. Rather than directly challenging Hope's racial insensitivity, Carson typically employed subtle redirection, moving conversations away from problematic territory without explicitly confronting his guest about the offensive nature of his remarks. Johnny smiled, but he knew the old jokes weren't funny anymore. This observation captures the essence of Carson's dilemma with Hope, maintaining respect for a comedy legend while recognizing that significant aspects of his humor had become objectionable to much of the audience. Carson's tight smiles and quick topic changes during Hope's more questionable remarks represented his attempt to navigate this contradiction without creating uncomfortable confrontations on air. What makes Hope's case particularly significant is how it illuminates the tension between honoring entertainment history and acknowledging its problematic elements. Hope had unquestionably made enormous contributions to American comedy and provided entertainment to troops during critical moments in American history. Yet these contributions came packaged with racist content that had caused real harm to the communities it targeted, a complexity that Carson never fully resolved in his treatment of Hope on The Tonight Show. Hope's continued defense of racist comedy well into changing eras reflected a broader resistance among many established entertainers to evolving standards of racial sensitivity, a resistance that viewed criticism of racist content as an attack on comedy itself rather than a legitimate concern about harmful stereotypes. Carson, caught between respecting Hope's legacy and acknowledging changing standards, chose a middle path that neither fully confronted nor completely ignored the problematic aspects of Hope's comedy, a compromise that itself reflected the incomplete nature of America's racial reckoning during the Carson era.
He's probably one of the most prominent actors in the entire world today. Would you welcome, please, Mr. Charlton Heston?
The Hollywood conservative Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston occupied a unique position in American culture when he appeared on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, a Hollywood star whose career spanned biblical epics like The Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur to science fiction classics like Planet of the Apes and Soylent Green. His commanding presence and distinctive voice had made him one of cinema's most recognizable figures, while his increasingly outspoken conservative politics set him apart in an industry dominated by liberal perspectives. These politics took on more controversial dimensions in his later years, particularly regarding race. As Heston became more politically active, especially through his leadership of the National Rifle Association, his public statements increasingly reflected perspectives that many critics viewed as dismissive of civil rights concerns and systemic racism in America. Became president of the NRA and in later years made statements that dismissed systemic racism, noted political analyst Jennifer Washington. Heston frequently characterized civil rights activists as whiners and suggested that racism was primarily a problem of the past rather than an ongoing systemic issue. These perspectives became increasingly central to his public persona during the later years of Carson's tenure. Carson's approach to Heston evolved as the actor's political activism became more prominent. While maintaining the professional courtesy he showed to all guests, Carson developed strategies to manage Heston's more controversial perspectives during Tonight Show appearances. Carson avoided pushing him too hard, but privately told writers to lighten up segments with Heston, revealed a former Tonight Show writer who worked with Carson in the 1980s. Johnny recognized that Heston was increasingly likely to steer conversations toward his political views, including perspectives on race that much of the audience would find objectionable. Rather than create confrontational moments, he instructed writers to develop lighthearted topics and nostalgic film discussions that would minimize opportunities for Heston's more controversial opinions. This approach reflected Carson's broader strategy with politically outspoken guests, maintaining the show's entertainment focus rather than allowing it to become a platform for divisive political views, regardless of whether those views came from the left or right. However, with Heston specifically, there was increasing concern about racial perspectives that went beyond standard conservative positions into more problematic territory. Known to belittle civil rights activists in off-camera conversation, Washington continued, behind the scenes, Heston's comments about civil rights leaders were often dismissive and occasionally veered into racial stereotyping. While these views rarely emerged explicitly during his Tonight Show appearances, the backstage comments concerned production staff who recognized the disconnect between Heston's dignified on-screen presence and his private attitudes. Carson's handling of Heston represents his characteristic indirect approach to problematic guests, neither confronting them directly nor providing an unrestricted platform for views he found troubling. By steering conversations towards safer territory while maintaining a cordial but not overly warm relationship, Carson attempted to respect Heston's stature while limiting opportunities for racially insensitive comments that might alienate viewers or legitimize harmful perspectives. He played Moses, but treated half the cast like they were still in Egypt. This observation captures the fundamental contradiction in Heston's public image. The gap between the noble, often liberating figures he portrayed on screen and his dismissive attitude toward modern liberation movements seeking racial equality. Carson never explicitly highlighted this contradiction on air, but his increasingly careful handling of Heston's appearances suggests growing awareness of the problematic nature of some of the actor's racial perspectives. Heston's case illuminates the challenge Carson faced with guests whose racial attitudes were embedded within broader political positions rather than expressed through explicit slurs or overtly racist statements. The subtle racism of dismissing systemic inequality or delegitimizing civil rights concerns presented different challenges than the more obvious racism of earlier entertainment eras, requiring more nuanced responses than Carson's typical strategies of redirection or gentle distancing could fully address.
Ask you something? Do you have a cord on your neck?
The insult comic, Don Rickles. Don Rickles represented a unique challenge for Johnny Carson regarding racial sensitivity, a comedian whose entire persona was built around insult humor that frequently targeted racial and ethnic identities. Known as Mr. Warmth, an ironic nickname given his caustic style, Rickles had developed a comedy approach that violated virtually every principle of racial sensitivity, yet had somehow established a unique cultural position where many viewed his most offensive material as somehow exempt from normal standards. Legendary insult comic, but many routines targeted Black, Asian, and Jewish guests, noted comedy historian Michael Barnes. Rickles' entire approach was built around abrasive, boundary-crossing insults. While he targeted everyone regardless of background, his material frequently relied on racial and ethnic stereotypes that would have been considered clearly offensive coming from almost any other performer. Rickles' racial material wasn't subtle or ambiguous. It directly employed slurs and stereotypes in ways that would have immediately ended most careers. His comedy pushed well beyond the boundaries of what other performers could get away with, even in the more permissive atmosphere of earlier decades. Called Sammy Davis Jr. a spear chucker on stage, Barnes continued. This wasn't isolated or accidental. Rickles routinely used explicit slurs and racial caricatures throughout his career. What made his case unique was the strange permission he seemed to have from many of the very communities he targeted, including performers like Sammy Davis Jr., who maintained friendship with Rickles despite being the target of his most offensive material. Carson's personal and professional relationship with Rickles added another layer of complexity to his appearances on The Tonight Show. Unlike some problematic guests whom Carson maintained professional distance from, Rickles was someone Carson genuinely enjoyed and considered a friend, creating a tension between his personal affection for Rickles and awareness of the increasingly problematic nature of much of his comedy. Carson loved him, but once reportedly told a producer, "If he says that word again, we're cutting to commercial," revealed a former Tonight Show staff member. This illustrated the contradictory position Carson found himself in, personally appreciating Rickles' fearlessness and quick wit, while recognizing that certain aspects of his comedy had become unacceptable for broadcast television as standards evolved. Carson navigated this contradiction through a carefully balanced approach, allowing Rickles significant latitude compared to other guests while still establishing certain boundaries that couldn't be crossed on network television. This created a unique dynamic where Rickles could engage in racial humor that pushed boundaries without completely violating the evolving standards Carson was attempting to maintain. The question of whether Rickles' comedy represented equal opportunity offensiveness or genuine racism remains debated among comedy historians and critics. His defenders point to his willingness to target everyone regardless of race and his friendships with many of the performers he insulted most aggressively. Critics note that regardless of intent or personal relationships, his amplification of harmful stereotypes and normalization of slurs contributed to broader patterns of racial harm in American entertainment. He said it was comedy, but it punched down more than it punched up. This observation captures a fundamental criticism of Rickles' approach, that despite targeting everyone, his humor often relied on stereotypes that reinforced existing social hierarchies rather than challenging them. While insulting powerful white figures for individual characteristics, he typically insulted minorities for their racial or ethnic identities, a distinction that became increasingly significant as American understanding of systemic racism evolved. Carson's handling of Rickles reveals the inconsistencies in television's racial awakening during this era, the way personal relationships, entertainment value, and established personas could create exceptions to standards that might be more strictly applied to other performers. While Carson established boundaries for what could air on The Tonight Show, his genuine affection for Rickles and appreciation of his comic gifts created a permissiveness that contrasted with his more careful handling of other racially problematic guests.
Come on now. Those jokes are easy to do, but this is a gorgeous, sweet, I could stoop to...
The charming rogue, Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds embodied a particular vision of roguish Southern masculinity during his peak fame in the 1970s and early 1980s. The charismatic good old boy whose mischievous smile and easygoing charm made him one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. His frequent appearances on The Tonight Show highlighted this charm, with Carson clearly enjoying Reynolds' self-deprecating humor and entertaining anecdotes. Behind this appealing persona, however, occasionally emerged racial attitudes reflecting his Southern upbringing during the Jim Crow era. Known for cowboy charm, but made several racially charged jokes in the 70s and early 80s, noted entertainment journalist Rebecca Santos. Reynolds had grown up in Florida during segregation, and while he was more progressive than many Southern men of his generation, his humor occasionally revealed lingering racial attitudes that became increasingly problematic as social awareness evolved during his career. Unlike some of Carson's more consistently problematic guests, Reynolds' racial insensitivity typically emerged as isolated incidents rather than persistent patterns, momentary lapses that contrasted with his generally more inclusive public persona. These incidents were nonetheless significant, particularly when they occurred on a platform with the reach and influence of The Tonight Show. One segment about Native Americans drew hundreds of complaints, Santos continued. During a 1978 appearance, Reynolds made several jokes about Native Americans that relied on stereotypes and dismissive attitudes toward their concerns. The segment generated an unusual volume of viewer complaints at a time when such feedback required writing physical letters rather than posting on social media. Carson's response to this particular incident revealed his growing awareness of changing standards regarding racial content. Rather than simply moving past the controversy, he took specific action to address it, though in a way that protected Reynolds from direct criticism while still acknowledging the problematic nature of the content. Carson pulled the footage from reruns for years, noted a former NBC executive familiar with the situation. This was a significant step at a time when Tonight Show reruns were a valuable part of the network's programming strategy. By removing the segment from the rerun package, Carson effectively acknowledged that the content was inappropriate without publicly criticizing Reynolds or drawing additional attention to the incident. This approach typified Carson's handling of racial issues throughout his tenure, addressing problems indirectly through programming decisions and subtle shifts in relationship rather than through explicit confrontation or public statements. It allowed him to respond to evolving standards without creating the kind of controversy that might alienate viewers or damage his relationships with celebrity guests. Reynolds' case is particularly interesting because his occasional racial insensitivity seemed disconnected from his broader public persona, which generally projected warmth and inclusivity toward people of different backgrounds. Unlike some performers whose racism formed a central part of their comedy or public statements, Reynolds' problematic moments appeared to be blind spots in an otherwise more progressive outlook, remnants of his upbringing that occasionally surfaced despite his conscious attitudes. He was a heartthrob until he opened his mouth. This observation captures the jarring contrast that sometimes emerged between Reynolds' appealing visual presence and the occasionally offensive content of his unscripted remarks. His charming persona and genuine likability made his lapses into racial insensitivity particularly disappointing to viewers who had embraced him as representing a more progressive vision of Southern masculinity. Carson's handling of Reynolds demonstrates how he approached racially problematic content from guests he personally liked and generally approved of, addressing specific incidents through programming decisions while maintaining the overall relationship. This measured response reflected Carson's broader approach to evolving standards, acknowledging changing sensibilities without creating the direct confrontations that might have alienated viewers or disrupted the entertainment-focused atmosphere he worked to maintain.
Later on, I was in Washington, D.C., and J. Edgar Hoover says, "Well, how are you, Bernard?" I said, "Bernard? Where'd you get that?" He says,
The comedy veteran, Red Skelton. Red Skelton represented an earlier era of American comedy when he appeared on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, a direct link to vaudeville, radio, and the early days of television comedy. His legendary status and contributions to multiple entertainment forms had earned him widespread respect, including from Carson himself, who had grown up watching Skelton's performances and clearly viewed him as a foundational figure in American comedy. This respect, however, created challenges as Carson attempted to navigate the significant gap between the racial sensibilities of Skelton's formative era and the evolving standards of later decades. Skelton had begun his career at a time when blackface and racial caricature were standard elements of mainstream American entertainment, practices he had participated in throughout his early years. Comedic legend with blackface history, noted entertainment historian Robert Thompson. Like many performers of his generation, Skelton had routinely employed blackface and racial caricatures in his early career. These weren't occasional lapses, but standard elements of entertainment during the era when he developed his approach to comedy. Unlike some performers who acknowledged the problematic nature of such material as social awareness evolved, Skelton maintained a notably defensive stance toward changing standards of racial sensitivity in comedy. When questioned about his past performances, or asked to reflect on the changing understanding of racist entertainment, he typically resisted acknowledging any legitimate concerns. Defended minstrel humor well into the 1980s, Thompson continued. During interviews, including on The Tonight Show, Skelton would occasionally express frustration with what he perceived as unnecessary censorship of traditional comedy forms. Rather than recognizing the harmful nature of minstrel traditions, he portrayed concerns about racial caricature as attacks on comedy itself. This perspective extended beyond mere defense of his own past work to criticism of the industry's increasing sensitivity to racial stereotyping. Skelton positioned himself as a defender of comedy traditions against what he characterized as excessive political correctness, views he occasionally expressed during Tonight Show appearances in ways that created clear tension with evolving standards. Criticized networks for getting too sensitive about race, noted a former NBC executive. During his later Tonight Show appearances in the 1970s and 80s, Skelton would sometimes complain about network standards that prevented certain types of racial humor he had employed throughout his career. These comments created awkward moments for Carson, who clearly respected Skelton's contributions to comedy while recognizing that many of his attitudes had become increasingly out of step with the show's audience. Carson's handling of these situations reflected his characteristic indirect approach, acknowledging Skelton's stature while creating subtle distance from his more problematic views. Rather than directly challenging Skelton's defense of minstrel traditions or use of racial stereotypes, Carson would typically acknowledge the comment with minimal enthusiasm before steering the conversation toward less controversial aspects of Skelton's career. Johnny respected his legacy, but the audience stopped laughing first. This observation captures the evolving dynamic between Skelton, Carson, and the Tonight Show audience during Skelton's later appearances. While Carson maintained professional respect for Skelton's historical significance, audience reactions to his more outdated racial perspectives became increasingly tepid, creating a tension that Carson navigated by emphasizing Skelton's undeniable contributions to comedy while minimizing opportunities for his more problematic views to dominate the conversation. Skelton's case illuminates the challenge Carson faced with guests whose entire comedic formation occurred during eras when racist entertainment was not merely accepted, but expected. Unlike younger performers who had developed their approach to comedy during periods of greater racial awareness, Skelton represented a direct link to entertainment traditions that were fundamentally intertwined with racist caricature and stereotyping. Carson's respect for these traditions' historical significance, while recognizing their increasingly problematic nature, created a contradiction he never fully resolved in his treatment of Skelton and similar comedy legends. Johnny respected his legacy, but the audience stopped laughing first. This observation also highlights an important aspect of television's evolving approach to racial content, the way audience reactions often drove change more directly than executive decisions or host preferences. As viewers became increasingly uncomfortable with racial stereotyping and defenses of blackface, their visible discomfort during live broadcasts created pressure that even established entertainment legends couldn't entirely ignore, though performers like Skelton often interpreted this changing response as political correctness rather than legitimate concern about harmful content.
I had 6 pars in a row. and we come to the seventh hole was a water hazard, and I made a bogey, 1 over.
The unapologetic throwback, Buddy Hackett. Buddy Hackett represented a particular challenge among Johnny Carson's regular guests, a comedian whose approach remained firmly rooted in an earlier era of American entertainment, despite the evolving standards around him. Known for his rubbery face, distinctive voice, and willingness to push boundaries with risque material, Hackett had built a successful career through nightclub performances, film roles, and television appearances. Throughout these varied contexts, racial humor remained a consistent element of his comedic approach. Frequently told racist jokes on and off air, noted comedy historian Michael Barnes, unlike some performers who moderated their material as social standards evolved, Hackett maintained essentially the same approach throughout his career, an approach that included racial stereotypes, ethnic accents, and jokes targeting various minority groups. On The Tonight Show, this created increasingly awkward situations as American awareness of racial sensitivity developed during Carson's tenure. What distinguished Hackett from some of Carson's other problematic guests was the deliberate, almost defiant nature of his continued reliance on racial material. While some performers inadvertently revealed dated attitudes or occasionally lapsed into problematic territory, Hackett actively embraced racial humor as a central aspect of his comedic identity, resisting pressure to update his approach even as standards around him changed significantly. Had a reputation among comics as the guy who never stopped telling World War II-era slurs, Barnes continued. Within the comedy community, Hackett became known for his unwillingness to evolve beyond the racial humor that had been standard during his formative years. While many comedians of his generation gradually adapted their material to reflect changing sensibilities, Hackett maintained an approach that younger comedians increasingly viewed as inappropriate and harmful. Carson's handling of Hackett reflected the complex balancing act he maintained throughout his tenure, respecting established performers while acknowledging evolving standards regarding racial content. Rather than banning Hackett entirely or allowing him completely free rein, Carson established boundaries that became increasingly strict as social awareness developed. Carson reportedly banned one routine from ever airing again, revealed a former Tonight Show staff member, after a particularly problematic segment in the mid-1970s that generated significant viewer complaints. Carson took the unusual step of explicitly prohibiting Hackett from performing certain material during future appearances. This represented a more direct intervention than Carson typically employed, with established performers indicating the exceptional nature of Hackett's resistance to evolving standards. This direct intervention, while unusual for Carson, still stopped short of the public confrontation or complete rejection that might have occurred in later eras. Instead, Carson maintained a professional relationship with Hackett while creating increasingly firm boundaries around acceptable content, an approach that allowed Hackett to continue appearing on The Tonight Show while limiting his opportunities to broadcast the most problematic aspects of his comedy. He belonged to a different time and refused to leave it. This observation captures the essential challenge Hackett presented for Carson and The Tonight Show, a performer whose comedic identity was so thoroughly rooted in an earlier era that adaptation to changing standards would have required fundamental transformation rather than minor adjustments. Unlike performers who could simply remove certain words or specific jokes, while maintaining their broader approach, Hackett's reliance on racial stereotyping was woven throughout his comedic identity. Carson's approach to Hackett illuminates his broader strategy for handling the tension between respecting entertainment history and acknowledging its problematic elements. Rather than entirely rejecting performers whose work included racist content or giving them unlimited platform to broadcast harmful material, Carson attempted to maintain connections to comedy's past while establishing evolving boundaries that reflected developing understanding of racism's impact. He belonged to a different time and refused to leave it. This observation also highlights the broader cultural challenge of addressing entertainment traditions developed during more openly racist eras. Hackett's steadfast refusal to adapt his material as standards evolved represented not just individual resistance, but a broader reluctance within parts of the entertainment industry to acknowledge how deeply racist traditions had shaped American comedy, a reluctance Carson himself never fully resolved, despite his generally progressive instincts regarding racial representation. Johnny Carson's handling of racially problematic guests throughout his 30-year tenure reveals not just individual instances of prejudice, but the broader evolution of American entertainment's approach to race during a pivotal period in the nation's history. From the early 1960s through the early 1990s, Carson navigated the tension between respecting established entertainment traditions and acknowledging their problematic foundations, creating a historical record of how one of television's most influential figures attempted to balance competing pressures during decades of rapid social change. What emerges from examining these challenging guests is not a simple narrative of progress, but a more complex picture of incremental change, inconsistent standards, and the powerful influence of personal relationships on Carson's approach to racial content. While clearly more progressive than many of his contemporaries, Carson never fully resolved the contradiction between his respect for entertainment legends and his recognition of the harmful racial content many of them produced or defended. His characteristic indirect approach, subtle distancing, topic redirection, programming decisions, and occasional behind-the-scenes boundaries reflected both the limitations of his era and his deliberate choice to maintain The Tonight Show's entertainment focus rather than positioning it as a platform for direct confrontation of social issues. This approach allowed him to acknowledge changing standards without alienating viewers or creating the kind of controversy that might have undermined his broad appeal across diverse American audiences. Perhaps most revealing is how Carson's handling of these guests evolved throughout his tenure, from the relatively uncritical acceptance typical of early 1960s television to the increasingly careful management evident in later decades. This evolution mirrored broader societal changes in racial awareness while maintaining Carson's characteristic restraint and preference for indirect rather than confrontational approaches to difficult subjects. As we look back on these challenging aspects of The Tonight Show's history, we gain valuable insight into how American entertainment gradually, and often incompletely, began addressing its racist foundations during television's formative decades. Carson's navigation of these complex waters, with all its compromises and inconsistencies, offers important historical context for understanding both how far American media has come in addressing racism and how much work remained unfinished when Carson signed off for the final time in 1992. The Tonight Show under Johnny Carson neither fully confronted nor completely ignored the racist elements of American entertainment. It occupied the ambiguous middle ground that characterized much of mainstream television during this transitional period, reflecting the incomplete and sometimes contradictory nature of America's racial reckoning in the latter half of the 20th century.